This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
When the HBO crime drama The Wire debuted in 2002, few took notice. A decade later, The Wire is an American cult classic, being taught on university campuses all around the country, whether it be William Julius Wilson teaching The Wire at Harvard University, or Duke University's own Anne Maria Makhulu, who will join us this afternoon to talk about teaching The Wire. And before then, we'll be joined by writer, author, thinker, Scott Poulson-Bryant, a founding member of the editorial collective of Vibe magazine, the legendary urban magazine, and the author of the brand new novel, The VIPs. This is Left of Black, and I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined this afternoon by a special guest, Mr. Scott Poulson-Bryant. How you doing, Scott?
I'm good up here in Cambridge. I'm doing good.
This has been a long time coming.
Right.
Finally getting you on Left of Black. And for those of you who don't know who Scott Poulson-Bryant is, first and foremost, a founding editor at the legendary urban magazine, Vibe magazine, the author of the 2005 book, Hung, A Meditation on the Measure of Black Men, and author of a brand new novel, The VIPs, which is published by Random House, their Broadway imprint, as well as the editor of the very popular blog spot, Scott Topics. And of course, on the side, while you're doing all this other great stuff, a second-year PhD candidate in the program in American Civilization at Harvard. So how are you keeping this all together, Scott?
By spit and string. No, I'm kidding. It's been a really interesting year because I'm about to start my third year, actually, and I'm in the middle of reading for my general exams, but I had to stop that to do promotion for the VIPs, which I wrote a year and a half ago. Before I really sort of got too deep into the PhD thing. But it's been a crazy time, but you get things thrown at you and you have to either catch them or let them drop. I'm trying to catch them,
Hey, if James Franco can get nominated for Academy Awards and take literature classes at Yale, Scott Poulson-Bryant, can take American Civ classes at Harvard and publish novels. But talk about these dynamics at this point in time, right? On the one hand, there's always been this kind of superficial split, particularly amongst the black intelligentsia, between the journalism class and the intellectual class. I mean, we see some of this now with the debates about Al Sharpton, at the desk, with his own show on MSNBC, and questions about, aren't there real journalists who can do this instead? Right. But I think when you think about our generation of writers and thinkers, the academics were always reading folks in Vibe magazine like Greg Tate and Nelson George and your colleague Joan Morgan. And by the same token, the journalists were also reading academics like Michael Eric Dyson and Trisha Rose. So it's really a false dichotomy. But what has it been having to really look askance at the journalism field now, right? Because folks can't live and be a journalist, at least not a print journalist anymore. To make this move into the academy. I mean, what has been some of the motivation for that?
Well, actually, some of the names you just stated are very influential in my life. For instance, it was Greg Tate's writing at the Village Voice that incorporated his theorizing about popular culture, African-American popular culture, using high theory, which really got me into thinking, oh, maybe I can do this. These are things I'm interested in as well. I was at Brown University at the time studying with Trisha Rose. She was my professor at Brown years ago when she was a grad student. And so I'm getting theory from her and reading Greg's journalism and seeing that stuff come together. And that was one of the reasons I dropped out of Brown and decided, I'm just going to go to New York and hit this Village Voice thing and learn from people like Greg Tate. For a long time, journalism sort of satisfied my Jones to, write about African-American masculinity and popular culture and sports and sort of, look at the world through my young black eyes. And so, tell my story and tell the story of a lot of other brothers and sisters But after a while, not even just financially speaking, that journalism is sort of dying a sad, slow death in a lot of ways.
Right.
But my last book, Hung, came out. And I realized writing that I wanted to grapple with, to take sort of a deeper approach to some of the themes I'd already been writing about. Right. And then I started getting emails from people like you and Jennifer Nash and Awan Mansett Mills. People were teaching Hung in their classrooms.
Right.
Paul Gilroy, all these people, you and Professor Gilroy that I really looked up to, were teaching my stuff in your classroom. And so I started thinking maybe, I can think about doing this academic thing, not lose the sort of verve and, drive I had as a popular culture journalist.
We're here with Scott Poulson-Bryant, writer, thinker, author of the brand new novel, The VIPs, published Random House in their imprint Broadway. You were around in 1993, of course, when Vibe is founded. And, for any of us that were in our early 20s, that moment in the early 1990s where, you have Ice Cube and Public Enemy and, there's just an incredible amount of energy, not just around hip hop, but urban culture in general. Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Mike Tyson. What was it like? I mean, I could imagine the vision of something like Vibe, if you're on the ground as a writer and editor there, that you couldn't even imagine what could be achieved at that particular moment.
No, I mean, I was at Spin magazine. I had started Spin in 1992, early 1991, actually. And I was, doing my back of the book column, Dreaming America, about hip hop. In many ways, it was the only hip hop coverage in Spin, other than when I wrote maybe a cover story on LL Cool J or somebody. Right. And then I got this call from Quincy Jones and the crew, I'm thinking about doing this thing. Do you want to come over and help us launch it? And to say that my dream was coming true is an understatement. Just the idea that there would be this magazine completely devoted to urban culture, done in an upscale, smart, beautiful way.
I mean, it was a good-looking mag. I mean, that was the other thing. Aesthetically, it was a good, especially when they were still doing the very big, version of it. I mean, it was just a beautiful magazine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we use the best photographers and we want to use the best writers and really give the culture its due. And it was called Volume for a while, and then we had to change the name, and I suggested the name Vibe because it just felt like it was literally catching a vibe that was at work in the culture. And, I think of that as my sort of contribution to popular culture, naming Vibe magazine. But yeah, I just thought it fit,
And that particular Vibe magazine, of course, has died on and it's been reborn in different forms. But when you think about the legacy of the magazine, I think about how Ebony has rebranded itself, and quite successfully, I might add, over the last year. And you can see, its nods, right, to Vibe magazine, right, and all the magazines that Vibe impacts, urban magazines since then. When you published Hung in 2005, right, and it's a book that's, really looking at the idea of black masculinity, the myth and the fiction of black masculinity, the kind of social attributes that we think of black masculinity, right, and the perfect title, Hung, right, the first thing that very often comes to mind about black men. And then you go forward to the VIPs. And for me, at least, reading VIPs and both having read and taught Hung, it's very difficult not to see where they inform each other. Here you have these four men, Barry Chambers, the alpha black male, Leo Bradford, who just happens to be an elite class, black queer, in some ways a very much a style maven in certain kinds of ways. Joey Ramirez, right, which I think is a cat that we all remember growing up with, right? The Latino cat that, that was cool with everybody, got all the women, and you just found yourself going, damn, he looked good in those clothes. I mean, that kind of dude. And then Duke Maynard, right? I can remember seeing the characters when, you were rolling out about the novel and having not read the novel yet and know the characters, because the way they're framed on the cover, you don't quite have a sense of necessarily what their race and ethnicity is.
The mystery.
And in my head, I'm immediately thinking Duke Maynard has to be like the black football player. And he's not, right? He's a working class white guy, who's more into hip hop right? You know, when the novel starts in 1983, then any of the other characters.
Any other characters, exactly.
And I can't help think about, you know, when you're writing this book or reading the novel, that summer of 1983 really is some sort of marker of the beginning of, on the one hand, the hip hop generation, but also this multicultural generation, you know, that we've seen rise over the last, you know, 25 years. Talk a little bit about, you know, the setting in the Hamptons, summer of 1983, in terms of telling a broader cultural story besides the one in the novel.
Right. I'm glad you pointed out about 1983, because I think of that as a very, very much turning point year in my own hip hop formation.
Sucker MCs,
also,
right?
There you go. Exactly. I remember being online in gym class and this kid, John Pratt, saying to me, "Have you heard Run DMC's record?" And I'm like, "I think I did. What is it?" And falling in love and never looking back. Right. And one of the reasons I wanted to set it in the Hamptons and Sag Harbor, especially, which is an African-American enclave, partially African-American enclave out in the Hamptons, was because I definitely wanted the novel to deal with some levels of class within the community, how hip-hop and popular culture defines some notions of class and how class operates throughout the community. And by making Duke a white dude who was completely into African-American culture, deal with the way, at that time, like you said, it was the beginning of this sort of multicultural movement going on in the culture, not even just the popular culture, but in the culture. I was growing up in Long Island at the time, and there were a lot of Latino immigrants coming into Long Island. The working class white kids who went to high school with us were hip hop heads. There wasn't a lot of breakdown in terms of tastes or in terms of, you know, representation. People just lived the music and lived the culture.
One of the things I loved about the novel, and you just mentioned this, the focus on Sag Harbor.
Right.
And of course, suddenly folks are looking at these kind of elites, leisure spaces of black folks because of the Obamas.
Right.
And this whole thing, you know, why does he keep going back to Martha's Vineyard every August? Because that's where the Negroes are. That's right. And, you know, that's where he comes back to, you know, to lick his wounds and reconnect. And, you know, Skip Gates is doing his little, you know, 3-day conferences and plenary sessions. I mean, but, you know, it's not a new phenomenon, right? You know, it's not happening because Barack is there now. You know, and you talk about even before Diddy's white parties, you know, out in the Hamptons, that this is an enclave for upper class black folks, right, to process the world, right, and with all the funkiness or positivity that comes with that.
Right, yeah. I had relatives who used to hang out in Sag Harbor back in the 70s and 80s, and I always remember there was a sort of Sag Harbor versus Martha's Vineyard faction. Yeah. Some people went north, some people went east.
Which you write about in the novel.
Right, exactly. I had to make a point of saying that in the novel. Friends and I, we used to hang out. You can definitely see the change in the Hamptons when hip hop sort of got its hold into it. When it became sort of party central in a way and opened up this whole new space of bling and ghetto fabulousness, as Andre Harrell calls it, thanks to Mr. Diddy. But yeah, I'm actually really interested though in how a lot of these spaces like the Vineyard and like Sag Harbor become these racialized spaces of leisure. And I've been investigating whether there's been a lot of scholarship done on that, because I sort of feel like there's a lot to just sort of the intersections of class and gender and race, and why these spaces, why the historical and times in the geographical spaces they are. You know what's interesting about Martha's Vineyard, though? Remember, Clinton used to go to Martha's Vineyard too.
Right. You know,
since he was our first
black president, right? And it's funny, you know, I was joking with our friend Joe Morgan. We were talking about the Vineyard. And why August? And it's like, well, it's when the water finally warms up. You know, Negroes aren't trying to get into cold water in May and June.
Joan was my Sag Harbor buddy, actually. We used to hang together at Sag Harbor in the 90s, yeah. I was actually we were on our way to Sag Harbor in 1992 when I got the phone call that we needed to find a new name for Volume. So I always sort of associate Vibe in a lot of ways with my Sag Harbor summers.
One of the things I love about the book, and this is really what good popular fiction does, right? On the one hand, it's a great story. You know, I've joked with you on Twitter and via email that, you know, I imagine there are literally thousands of people who've asked you already, you know, have you sold the rights to this, you know, as a film, right? Because it is that kind of story, right? And not something we expect to see as a BET movie either, right? You know, something that we could very much imagine in terms of being a mainstream Hollywood movie. You know, so I almost want to jokingly ask you, you know, have you thought about who you would cast in each role in terms of the characters?
All the time. Funny, when I was writing it, I tried not to do that because I didn't want the characters to get too concretized sort of in my brain. I wanted to keep it sort of fluid, and I felt like if it got too concretized for me, it would get too concretized for the reader. But now that it's out and people have been talking to me about the book, there's actually this cat, Brian White, this actor Brian White, who he was on Men of a Certain Age. I think he'd be perfect as Barry. I think he has that whole attitude thing, the looks thing, the womanizer thing. I think he could rock that. A lot of people have been talking about, who's the cat from Brother to Brother? Anthony Mackie. Anthony Mackie as Leo.
Right.
Considering what we find out about Leo later in the novel, I think that's an interesting choice. But you know, so there's a couple of names you can slip in there. Joan and I were talking about Adam Rodriguez as Joey. So his name comes up all the time. And playing Duke, the white dude, some people have suggested Paul Walker. Some people have suggested who's the guy who dances, Channing Tatum. I think there's a lot of different types you can fit in there. The thing is, the dudes have to be able to age from like 20 to 40, you know, so they have to have some youthfulness to them.
We're talking with Scott Poulson-Bryant, who was a founding editor of Vibe magazine, the author of Hung, A Meditation on the Measure of Black Men, and the brand new novel, The VIPs, published by Random House and the imprint Broadway. You know, Hung, the subtitle is A Meditation and Measure of Black Men, but in many ways, VIP, you know, talking about the other piece of this, besides the entertaining piece, is really a meditation on thinking about masculinity in this particular moment. I mean, all the characters in certain kinds of ways push against boundaries, whether it be race or class or sexuality or the messy way that all those things come together. You know, how do you deal with like Joey, you know, who I don't even think bisexual is a way to capture it, right? Maybe polysexual or something, you know, metasexual, something, you know, you know, because
sexual,
because you know, his desire is so fluid. You know, that it really is empowering in certain kind of ways and progressive and radical in terms of thinking about masculinity at this point in time. You know, talk about how the experience at Harvard and an American Civ program, you know, that kind of stuff, and you mentioned reading theory, you know, coming from a Greg Tate or Trisha Rose. Talk about how that stuff weighs in the process of writing fiction.
That's a really, really good question. Fiction is actually what I started off writing in high school, and when I first got to undergrad, that was all I wrote. It was, like I said, it wasn't until reading The Village Voice that I sort of discovered journalism and decided to pursue it. It's also an easy way to make a living when you're dropping out of college. You're not going to make a living writing New Yorker short stories when you're a 21-year-old black dude. So, well, maybe not. I shouldn't say that. It's worked for some people, but not me. But that said, yeah, I feel like writing this novel in a lot of ways was a culmination of a lot of the things I've been thinking about, and also opens up space for me to deal with a lot of these issues in more fictional narratives. But the four characters in the VIPs, to me, were, I mean, I wanted them to be appealing, flawed, interesting characters that people would fall in love with and hate. But I also wanted them on some level to be sort of representative of the different sort of changing same of masculinity in a way. The way that hip hop has influenced what masculinity means for black men and for white men and for Latino men. The way that class informs, like you said, inflects certain ways of dealing with sexuality across communities. I definitely wanted to grapple with some of that stuff. And it became sort of an adventure of sorts, creating characters like Joey and giving them agency about who they are, and not sort of over-explaining who these people were, just sort of letting them live, letting them breathe, and hoping that the reader would identify with them.
We're here with Scott Poulson-Bryant, author of the new novel, The VIPs. You're watching Left of Black. When you started at Vibe in 1993, Scott, it's yourself, Kevin Powell was a writer, Joan Morgan, folks like Dream Hampton, Jimmy Israel. I mean, all these folks are coming through. Raquel Cepeda. I mean, just all these incredible minds. And I would argue, looking at it from the academic side, that this is a generation of thinkers that really have never gotten their due as thinkers. Right. In one hand, because we downplay journalists as thinkers, of course, unless they're white male journalists.
Exactly. Right.
And I know Joan has often talked about the difficulty of being a journalist even now, trying to write about things beyond the little black box that we're supposed to have expertise in. And those kinds of things. But, now that you're on the other side of this, right, and really not even on the side, right, you're really still in both worlds.
Sort of, right.
Yeah. Who are the thinkers now, that you're reading that really kind of push you to pause, right, and rethink your position on some things?
Wow, that's a really good question, because if I'm completely honest with you, I have found that I don't read as much journalism or even hip-hop journalism as I used to.
And what the hell is hip-hop journalism?
And what the heck is hip-hop journalism anyway, right? But two things happened to me. I came back to school, obviously, but before going back to school, I taught a class at Brown University called Black Popular Journalism and Black Popular Culture. And I taught Raquel's book, And It Don't Stop, her anthology of
hip-hop journalism.
Incredible writing. And I realized that a lot of stuff I read today doesn't feel as engaged as a lot of stuff that I read 15 years ago. And I don't mean to sound like sort of like the bratty sort of, mean old, bad old man, because maybe that's what I'm becoming, I don't know. But I sort of feel like there's a different sort of project at work right now when it comes to like hip hop journalism or journalism about hip hop and African American urban culture. It seems to be less engaged with sort of like the larger themes a lot of us, I feel like we're dealing with, and more sort of obsessed with the sort of quotidian, the sort of everyday sort of, I don't know, the sort of minor moments, for lack of a better way to describe it.
And incredibly ahistorically. Ahistorical.
That's a perfect word to think. I mean, I remember having conversations like with Joan and Kevin, for instance, and Dream about the work we were doing, but how it sort of connected to work that we thought Baraka was doing, or that Angela Davis was doing, or, not to put ourselves in those categories, but we definitely felt like we were part of a continuum, sort of an intellectual continuum process, if you will.
How do you think the blogosphere has changed that? I mean, on the one hand, we know the blogosphere has really democratized thought and ideas, right? But at the same time, devalued that thought and idea. So the idea of working for $2 a word, that's you'd be lucky if you're working for $2 a paragraph, right? and in terms of the blogosphere, folks are working for nothing, right? That's the HuffPost model. How much of that do you think has changed, that it's forced folks not to have to really go deeply on the one hand, but have to know what was said before them? Right. Right. On the one hand, it's the lack of editors involved in the process, right? Editors are wonderful people, right? You hate them when you're working on something.
I worship editors. I hear you.
Inevitably, they help audiences better read your pieces, right? But how do you think that democratization in terms of the blogosphere has really changed the trajectory of writing at this point in time?
My students a couple of years ago, I asked them on the first day of class what magazines and newspapers they read on daily, weekly, or monthly basis. Of the 21 students, most 20 of them said, I don't read magazines or newspapers, or I read blogs. I get all my music information from this kid's blog in Philly. You know what I mean? And that's great. Like on some level, like you said, democratizing the culture, that's a wonderful thing. But there's also this way that the lack of journalistic experience and editorial control and stuff comes into mix, and I think the writing suffers. And the thinking can be there, but because a lot of the writing suffers, the points that I think are striving to be made don't get made as well. So there's this way that I'm very old school. I'm very much like get your prose together. Like, make sure your message is clear. All those sort of old school journalistic things that were really important, as important to me as voice and as character and as point of view. And I feel like it's a lot of voice and a lot of point of view, but not a lot of good journalism.
And for folks to be able to make distinctions between good ideas and the execution of those good ideas, because a lot of folks come with great ideas and in some ways want to have a proprietary relationship with those ideas, but then those ideas fall apart in the execution, and someone comes along who's more skilled at the execution. Right. And folks forget where that idea originated. Right.
And end up losing.
And exactly, on that end, you want to come up with your craft just so you can better claim your ideas. Right?
Exactly. Now, perfectly put. Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. We've been joined by Scott Poulson-Bryant, who was a founding editor of Vibe magazine in 1993. He is the author of the 2005 book Hung, A Meditation on the Measure of Black Men. I love that title. The author of the brand new novel published by Random House on its Broadway imprint, The VIPs. Also the editor of the blog Scott Topics, and a third-year PhD candidate in the program in American Civilization at Harvard. Please give a shout out to Skip and Marcy and all those good folks up at Harvard for me.
I definitely will. Skip's one of my advisors, actually.
Oh, that's great.
Like Professor Gates. I
Professor
can't call
Gates,
him
yes.
Skip until I get my PhD. So raise that part.
I can call him Skip. What's up, Skip?
You can, right. You can. I can, right.
Thanks for joining us, Scott.
Thanks for having me, man.
You'd rather live in shit than let the world see you work a shovel.
I mean, don't get it twisted. I do some dirt too, but I ain't never put my gun on nobody who wasn't in the game.
A man must have a code.
Oh, no doubt.
The game is rigged, but you cannot lose if you do not play.
It's Baltimore, gentlemen. The gods will not save you.
We used to make shit in this country, build shit. Now we just put our hand in the next guy's pocket.
Avon, you gotta think about what we got in this game for, man. Huh? Was it the rep? Was it so our names can ring out on some fucking ghetto street corners, man? Nah, man, there's games beyond the fucking game.
That's my money.
Man, money ain't got no owners. Only spenders.
I will kick his ass, but the next morning, I still wake up white in a city that ain't.
Just a weak-ass mayor of a broke-ass city.
All the pieces matter.
Thin line between heaven and hell. All in the game, yo. All in the game.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm Anthony Neal, your host, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Anna Marie Makhulu, Professor of Cultural Anthropology and African American Studies here at Duke University. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming through. I wanted to sit down and talk to you because you are one of the many professors, many folks in our profession that has become enamored with The Wire.
Right.
The HBO series that debuted, almost a decade ago, that a lot of folks didn't watch when
Me
it was
included.
on, but has really become, really this fixation afterwards. And you teach a course here on The Wire at Duke University. Talk a little bit about the class and what you're hoping to achieve with it. I mean, you're an Africanist, right? You do research on South Africa and particularly urban terrain in South Africa. What made The Wire appealing for you?
So I was one of those people who didn't watch The Wire while it was airing beginning in 2003. And discovered it after the final season was over while I was on sabbatical. And sort of steadily watched it for about 5 months. It took me about a month to get through a season. And it just struck me that it told a sort of, in the best sense, a totalizing story about the American inner city. From a variety of institutional perspectives, including the schools, the question of labor and unions.
The press. Right?
The press, exactly. And so as an urbanist, I thought actually it was a great hook for me. And as you say, I'm in fact an Africanist and I work on South Africa. I work specifically on questions of what are now called human settlements. Some people, like Mike Davis, like to call them slums, on the periphery of the city of Cape Town. And so while Baltimore obviously looks very, very differently from a place like a Johannesburg or a Cape Town or a Sao Paulo, some of the same questions pertain. And so I suppose though many of the folk who are teaching this course think about it as television or media, or are literary people who are worrying about narrative, taking that kind of perspective, mine is generally that of an urban anthropologist,
ethnographer,
an ethnographer as well, which I think David Simon is. And also a cultural geographer who's interested in the relationship between configurations of urban space and power.
You mentioned that you sat down and you watched, it for 5 months, and every story that I've heard of folks who came to The Wire afterwards, right? It's almost like an addiction.
Yes.
Right. You watch those first couple of episodes, and it becomes so compelling, and you just find yourself sitting there, and the next thing you know, you've watched 5 seasons, and you've given up 12 hours a day in some cases. What made you think about teaching it? And because that's an interesting kind of dynamic also, right? I think there are many folks, even academics, who simply got a pleasure out of watching it, right? It's a great story, right? But how does it translate in the classroom is a different kind of question.
So, I mean, I think it does go back to how all 5 seasons together tell a total story about, let's call it, the American city in decline. And of course, that's not just an American story, and being someone who is a kind of comparativist, I'm interested in the bigger picture. So, I mean, for example, last night was basically the first substantive session of the semester for the course. And so, really what I was trying to convince students of was the idea that, on the one hand, this is definitely about Baltimore, but it's also about the nature of cities in a global system. I mean, this is specifically my kind of perspective, which is why, frankly, season 2, Against the Grain, perhaps, is my favorite season, because it does a lot of work for me as someone who's interested in global flows of trade, of commodities, and of course people, given the human trafficking angle. And enables me to play to my strengths, which have to do with being concerned with work and increasingly what people like Michael Denning call wageless life. And so that's sort of the hook. The other side of it is to say to, classroom of 18 Duke students who maybe, and this is not making any presuppositions about what they might think at the outset, maybe imagine the American ghetto, the black ghetto, to be somehow separate from, distinct from the nature of cities otherwise. And to say, hold on a second, let's think about the underground economy. Let's think about the drug trade. First of all, where are these drugs coming from? And let's think about why it is that there is a concentration of poverty, in places like that. And why is it that that hinges on activities that are regarded as illicit or illegal? Does this not have something to do with the kind of maldistribution of work opportunities and skills? So to kind of build this out and to say, well, actually, maybe the West Side of Baltimore has something deeply implicated about it in the lives of people living on the other side of town in comfortable suburbs. To quote Bubbles, it's a fine line between heaven and here.
Absolutely.
And that's really, for me, what was compelling about it. Or Baltimore Hempstead, exactly. That's what's very compelling for me about it.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor Anne Maria Makhulu, Professor of Cultural Anthropology and African-American Studies here at Duke University, who is teaching a course this semester, as she does every year, on The Wire. One of the things that's interesting about this kind of backstory about The Wire, our current U.S. president, Barack Obama, claimed on the campaign trail that he was a big fan of it.
Yes.
And yet there are those moments, particularly when you consider unemployment rate now, and it's like you almost want to suggest to him maybe you should go back and watch
it again.
Some of it,
Yes.
and that raises the question that what kind of impact do you think, at least that you've been able to discern, in your work around The Wire, what kind of impact do you think it actually has had on public policy? Yeah.
Right. That's actually a tough question to answer. I mean, I can talk about it from the perspective of maybe policy students that I might have in the class, and students in general. That, I think people come in with ideas about, even at this current historical moment, the sort of pegging hope on the notion of the American dream. Right? And it's no coincidence that the American dream as a certain kind of ideological object appears in The Wire sporadically. Right. So I'm just thinking of someone like Omar wearing a T-shirt, I think it's in a courtroom scene, that says, "I am the American dream."
Right.
Right. And I think that that's, of course, very self-conscious on the part of people like Ed Byrne and David Simon. By the end of the course, people are asking very profound questions about the possibility of the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative. We do, in fact, read Truslow Adams' The Epic of America, the epilogue. He's the person who coins the term, the American dream, just to start thinking about what the significance of this is in this current conjuncture and what the possibilities for it are, given all the numbers are so funny these days. I mean, I think we all used to talk about the other half. So assuming, if only rhetorically, 50% of people have and 50% of people don't.
And that doesn't work.
Right. Now apparently it's 80-20.
Right.
And then of course there's the discussion about the 98% and the 2%, which does bring us back to policy questions. How it has a direct impact on policy, I don't know, but I guess that would be my response. I mean, you can sort of convince one person at a time, perhaps, in the context of the classroom. Yeah.
One of the things that's brilliant about The Wire, it clearly is, narrative driven, right? I mean, these big stories, these big ideas. Right. But it's also powerfully character driven.
Yes.
When you think about, who become almost like lifelong characters in our head. The Omars, as one of the great examples that, Bubs, and the person that, I find most compelling, someone like Stringer Bell, who in many ways is the embodiment of that American dream that you're talking about. That's what his investment, I mean, that's why he's in the trade in the first place. Yeah. Who are some of the characters that you find yourself drawn to?
So you've probably played the Facebook game where you answer a series of questions, and as a consequence, Facebook by algorithm, of course, maps out who you are most like.
Right,
yes.
Right.
I am sorry to say that I'm apparently Lester Freeman. So I'm sort of methodical and,
but he has this back life, right? I mean,
he does.
I mean, it's like this, yeah.
Yeah, he ends up with a stripper. He makes miniature furniture. Yes, I mean, there's more to him than first meets the eye. But yes, in terms of favorite characters, Stringer is definitively one of them.
And Stringer's an interesting character on so many levels. One, this idea of the American dream, right? He's the thinker. Right.
He is the thinker.
Clearly, in the context of the series, he also is the breakout sex symbol, right? I mean, there's.
Oh yes.
As I watch, I have my own man crush, right, on Stringer Bell, and it's interesting the way that they managed to package that in a way. On the one hand, allows you to really see him as a thinker, but he also becomes the eye candy, right?
That's right. He has his pince-nez glasses that he always wears, just on the tip of his nose, and his teacup with the tea bag label sticking out, and slurps quite loudly when he's doing it and is doing the books. And yes, then on the other hand, he sort of undresses people with his eyes, basically.
And yet Idris Elba is, someone who is British. And what does it mean that someone who clearly, you know, is has this kind of really cosmopolitan sensibilities could so comfortably slide, you know, into this, you know, Baltimore drug dealer?
Yes. Well, he's a very fine actor.
Yeah.
I actually have started watching Luther.
Yes, I have. I have also.
Yes. And of course, there he is. Well, he's not as shiny and as handsome
older,
as
he's gruff. Yeah.
Yeah, he's pretty much a mess, and in some ways rawer than he is on The Wire. But so yes, I think he's a very fine actor, and he has tremendous versatility, not least in his capacity to sound like he comes from Baltimore as opposed to sounding the way he normally does. But you know, as a character, he's incredibly compelling, and I think the sort of punctuation to his life is the scene where McNulty and Bunk go to his apartment, and you see this amazingly pristine, tasteful apartment by the water, probably in the Inner Harbor, which has been the subject of so much.
And they were expecting the velvet poster, right?
I'm sure they were. And he's actually come full circle from being the young adolescent boy who was shoplifting at the Inner Harbor to being a real estate developer overlooking the Inner Harbor. I'm assuming that's where his apartment is. And of course, McNulty can't believe that this is where Stringer would live, and pulls you know, strategically a book off the shelf, which is Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which goes precisely to this question of his striving and indeed pulling himself up by his bootstraps. Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Anne-Marie Makhulu, Professor of Cultural Anthropology and African-American Studies here at Duke University. You're teaching here at Duke University, right? And that itself says something about what the composition of your class might look like. And you mentioned some of this a little earlier. And they're clearly, some of these students are bringing certain kind of expectations of what they think of the world that The Wire creates, right? What they think of the black bodies that populate. What's it like going through this 12, 14-week process to really push back and challenge them a little bit on what they think about these bodies in this world?
So of course Duke students are not a homogeneous group, and there are some surprises along the way as you begin to be more familiar with them and to find out where they're coming from. So for example, last semester I was actually quite surprised to find out, you know, in an informal poll in the classroom, that with the exception of one student, they had all been to public high schools. And therefore very much were invested in season 4 of The Wire, which isn't to say they had all been to inner city public schools, right? But you know, had their own position on what public education might promise, and also, of course, the ways it might disappoint. But it is certainly true that there's a kind of feeling our way through, especially in the first few weeks. And you know, what are we doing watching a show that in some ways, it's not a question of romanticizing or glorifying or spectacularizing the black ghetto, but nevertheless making it an object of some kind of scrutiny. And so early in the semester, there's often some interesting conversations that begin with we, collective pronoun, in this classroom, as opposed to them, you know, in that world there. But interestingly, over the course of the weeks, that distinction begins to break down. And I think that there is a great deal of empathy for characters. And also a kind of increasing care around, again, not romanticizing or spectacularizing a kind of melodramatic character like Omar, who probably has some you know, has some relevance to someone in real life, not quite like Omar, but maybe fairly like him, right? So, but it's not only about race, it's about class.
Powerfully about
It's about gender, it's about sexuality. Another of the terms that seems to slip in at the beginning and then tends to disappear is, well, so-and-so is obviously living out a certain lifestyle. And which goes back to the question of the American dream and whether you can choose to be a part of the American dream or not, or whether it chooses you. And my response is always, do you think it's a lifestyle to live in a burnt-out vacant?
Right, to have to accommodate to your conditions.
Yes.
Very different than a lifestyle choice.
Yeah, lifestyle sounds more like Kim Kardashian making a choice about what she's going to wear tonight, you know. So those things are there, but I have to credit the show and its writers, really, with forcing the hand of people such that over the course of the weeks, those distinctions no longer seem to hold. I mean, another complicated one is sexuality. I think Snoop, for example, is a very complicated character.
Female masculinity, right?
Right. Oftentimes people assume that she's gay.
Right.
That's not really what's going on there. And again, over the course of the weeks, people come to recognize that perhaps the reason that she is threatening or dangerous is precisely because she's straddling a kind of gender line. So we often work with that amazing scene at the beginning of, I think it's season 4 or 5, where Snoop, must be 4, I think, Snoop goes to a hardware store to buy a nail gun. And clearly this conversation is predicated on misrecognition of who she is, what she is, and what she does. And that tends to be very helpful in beginning to work out who she is. So, yeah.
What are you working on these days? I know you're finishing up a manuscript. Talk a little bit about it.
Yes. So the manuscript is provisionally entitled The Geography of Freedom, The Limits of Change in South Africa, and focuses on informal settlements or shanty towns on the outskirts of Cape Town. And really, you know, it's a fairly simple argument, although historically made quite difficult and challenging by the things that have happened, especially since 1994, but to suggest that there's surely a relationship between the configuration of urban space and the political horizon. And I suppose going to South Africa originally, beginning in the very early post-apartheid period, sort of 96 on, I assumed, like many people, that these kinds of informal settlements would probably shrink and dissipate with the democratic effort at reconstruction and development.
And that hasn't happened.
And that isn't exactly what's happened, and there's actually been a proliferation of informal settlements that have to do with both policy, but also the kind of neoliberalization of the economic landscape in South Africa. And so I'm really playing with the idea of freedom in a double sense, which is to say freedom in the strict sense of gaining independence, of decolonizing, these spaces as representing stepping stones to the city and therefore being almost emancipated zones even under apartheid. And how now they are in some ways free spaces because they are neoliberalized, because public housing is delivered via private means. And so that's essentially what I'm working on at the moment. I'm trying to finish the revisions.
We have to make sure to have you back when the book comes out.
Thank you very much. I would love it.
You've been watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor Anne-Marie Makhulu, who's Professor of Cultural Anthropology and African-American Studies at Duke University, teaching this semester a course on the wire. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
You try
produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.